Hi, my name is Simoose, and today I'll be creating DnD. On this channel, I show you the practical steps I take when creating my own custom content for my own DnD games. My aim is to encourage and inspire other DMs to do the same. Of course, feel free to use anything I create on this channel in your own home games. Today, I'll be creating a monster stat block for a companion NPC called Artus Icegrain. Artus is a human towns guard in the city of Luskan. The party met him during our last session while solving a murder mystery. Artus has agreed to accompany them to the Luskan graveyard, as multiple clues are pointing in that direction. Now normally I don't create custom stat blocks for token NPCs like guards, shopkeepers and the like. When needed, I would grab one of the stat blocks in the monster manual and maybe give them another weapon on the fly. But I can envision Artus to tag along for a couple more sessions, and I want my companion NPCs to be just a bit more effective and memorable in combat. Luskan has a proud archery tradition, so I want the primary weapon of Artus to be some kind of bow. The party also learned that Artus is in command of 3 other towns guards, so I would like to give him some leadership qualities. With those things in mind, let's start creating. The tool I'll be using today is the DnD 5e Statblock Generator. I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes. Now, this tool allows you to easily load up one of the existing monsters of the monster manual and then adjust it. Of course, when using any licensed DnD content, make sure that you have access to a legal copy of that content. Now, the first stat block to be looking at would be the one of a guard. So looking that up, we can click use preset and see the guard stat block here. Now, what immediately catches my attention is that a guard has a challenge rating of 1/8. I want to create an NPC that can jive with the rest of the party. My party is a 5th level party, so having to work together with a 1/8 challenge rating NPC is like having to babysit a 1st level character. That's not a lot of fun. So I'll be looking for a stat block with a bit higher of a challenge rating. Now specifically, I'll be looking for a stat block with a challenge rating of 2, because that's what the quick matchup table suggests in Xanatar's Guide to Everything on page 91. This bandit captain stat block really fits the bill. It's a CR2 creature, it has some reactions, has some weapons, gives us some idea of the hit points that we want our creature to have, the armor class that we want them to have. Looking at this stat block as a reference will allow us to create an NPC stat block of a roughly equal power level. So one of the first things I want to do is look at the damage output of this creature so that we can do something similar. Now this captain can make 3 melee attacks, 2 with its scimitar, 1 with its dagger. It can also choose to make 2 ranged attacks with its daggers, but the damage output of those will be lower, so I won't be looking at that. So looking at the first option, making 3 attacks, 2 with a scimitar, we see that a scimitar has an average damage output of 6. So making 2 scimitar attacks has an average damage output of 12. Adding the 5 damage the dagger would do, we get an average damage output of 17 hit points per round. So our aim is to do something similar with Artus. So the bandit captain also has a reaction. They can add 2 points to their AC against a melee attack that would otherwise hit them. This doesn't really fit the theme that we want to do with Artus, so we'll be removing that. So the first thing that I will change is the name of the NPC. This will become Artus Icegrain. So Artus is a medium-sized humanoid. More specifically, he's a human and his alignment is lawful good. So I will leave the hit dice at this level. 65 is a very respectable health pool at this point in my campaign, and I'll leave the armor class as is as well, as I don't really have any reason to change that design. So looking at the ability scores, I know that I want Artus to be an archer. Now the bandit captain has a dexterity of 16, and that gives Artus a +3. I would like that to go up by a point, so to do that I have to put this at 18. So whenever I do this with an NPC stat block, I try to lower other abilities for the same amount. The easy ones to lower are intelligence, wisdom and charisma, because those only really come into play when creating a caster or when thinking about saving throws. But I do think that the health pool is a bit at the high end right now, comparing it to the PCs in this party. So I'm inclined to take those points from Constitution. And now when I update the stat block, you will already see these changes in effect. And it effectively hit 10 points of the health pool, but I think that's fine. And it gives Artus a better chance of hitting with his bow. Now for saving throws, I won't be giving Artus a proficiency in wisdom saving throws because that doesn't make a lot of sense. but I do want him to feel trained in strength and dexterity, so I'll leave those as is. For skills, I don't think that Artus would be particularly skilled in deception. I do believe that he would be trained in athletics and acrobatics. And as a member of the town's guard, I would add investigation and insight to that list as well. Now, those might not come into play, but it's just a nice thing to round out this NPC. Now, he does not have any condition immunities, nor does he have any particular vulnerabilities or resistances or immunities to damage types. The languages he speaks are common, and in my version of Luskan, he would be knowing Dwarvish as well. He does not have any special senses. We can keep the challenge rating at 2. So let's update one more time to see all of that in action. And we're already here at the abilities, actions and reactions parts. Multi-attack is something that gets put on stat blocks because of action economy. And to understand this, you have to think about the lifespan of a monster. A common monster in DnD has maybe 3 or 4 rounds of combat before he kicks the proverbial bucket. So if you would only allow a monster to have 1 attack each round and they miss some of those attacks, you would need a lot more monsters to create an enticing combat. So that's why a lot of monsters have multi-attack, because if they have to fight a party of 3 or 4 members, each attack counts, right? Artus will be joining our party and will be on that side of our equation. For that reason, I don't want to give him multi-attack. It's not something that adds to the fun, it's not something that adds to the fantasy. So I will be deleting multi-attack, but I will be creating more flavorful and fun ways to add to the damage output later on. Now, I already said that I want the main weapon of Artus to be a bow, and specifically I'm thinking about a longbow. The cool thing about this tool is that all of the standard weapons of the player's handbook are already in this. So if I search for longbow, I can find those stats here and use it as a preset. So now you see longbow, it's a ranged weapon attack. And now these things in parentheses, these are special functions, if you will. And if you check this box, you can see how these work. Now, I won't go over this formatting right now. It's pretty straightforward once you get used to it, but it's a very handy tool to allow you to create an ability or an action once and not have to think about it when changing ability scores later on. These things will just auto-update along with you. So when looking at the longbow text here, you can see that this is a standard text that you would find on a lot of monsters. So for instance, when you see dex 1d8, it means that you will have a damage output of 1d8 plus your dex modifier. So if I add this action, it will appear in this actions list. Now I will be removing the scimitar from the list and I'll rearrange these so that the longbow is at the top. Now when updating the stat block, you'll see that the longbow has become one of the actions here and it's the first one in the list. So that makes it clear to anyone using this NPC stat block that this is the main action that Artus will be taking. Now with our current stats, we have a damage output of 8. That leaves us with about 9 additional points of damage that we would like to output in order to keep our challenge rating of 2. Remember that we already dropped the hit points of Artus, so that means that the actual challenge rating of Artus might already be a bit lower than 2. So we really want this damage output to be much higher. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll up his dex modifier even more so that this becomes 5. Now I don't want to change the constitution anymore, but I do think that we can take 1 point away from strength and have Artus be a bit less charismatic. And I think that's fine. And now this already gives us an average damage output of 9, which means that we still have a long ways to go. Now, one thing I didn't immediately think about is that by raising this dexterity score, we are also raising the armor class of Artus. And it has already become 17, which is pretty high for what I want. So I think that I'll be changing his armor type to leather so that this drops down to 16 again. So now this all seems pretty balanced to me to keep this challenge 2 rating if we manage to increase this damage output by about 8 till 9 damage points each round. Now another thing that I already said I wanted to do is remove this reaction. We don't want Artus to have the parry reaction. And the last thing that's on here is this dagger. Now one flaw that you'll see is that these defaults are not using the special formatting. So in order to fix this, just look up the dagger. I want it to be dexterity based, and use this preset and add action. Now it will update and you will see that the dagger now has a bigger damage output. It's a little flaw in the system. I wish they would change it, but it's not that big to overcome. Now I will allow Artus to keep his dagger for when he ever does get into melee combat, but ideally he wants to retreat as fast as possible. So one of our design goals was to create an archery based NPC, and we already did that. Now the second design goal is to create an NPC that feels like a leader type. To do that, I'll be looking at the fighter class, more specifically the battle master and the maneuvers that can be found on PHB page 74. So the way that maneuvers work is fighters get a pool of superiority dice. And when performing specific actions or reacting to specific events, they can spend one of those dice to have an effect happen. Most of the times that effect also creates additional damage output in the form of a D8. So I already made a choice of things that might make our NPC feel like a leader. The first one is Commander Strike. Now Commander Strike says when you take the attack action on your turn, you can forego one of your attacks and use a bonus action to direct one of your companions to strike. When you do so, choose a friendly creature who can see or hear you and expend one superiority die. That creature can immediately use its reaction to make one weapon attack, adding the superiority die to the attack's damage roll. So straight off the bat, this is a perfect leadership type ability. It gives Artus the possibility to view the battlefield, look what's going on, and tell one of his guards to attack. But some of these things need to change for our template. So Artus can only do one attack action, and we don't want him to forgo that attack because we want the damage output to increase, and that wouldn't happen if we do that. So in order to do this, we'll make a reaction out of this. Recent templating has added bonus actions to monster stat blocks, but the tool I'm using doesn't support that yet. So I'll be working with that restraint, and I'll be using a reaction instead. So that means that Artus will lose the possibility of doing a attack of opportunity, but as I don't really want him to be in melee combat at all, that doesn't really bother me that much. I want to make sure that it's clear that this template does not allow Artus to command the PCs. Artus can only command those who are under his command. So I'll be changing this to direct a creature under your command. So when you do so, choose a friendly creature who can see or hear you and expend one superiority die. Artus won't actually be using the superiority die mechanic, so the expenditure of those dice will be deleted. And that means that I can shorten this sentence. Now, using this template, that creature also has to use its reaction to make the weapon attack. That means that they also lose their attack of opportunity. As I don't want this to become a negative in the long run, I want to be able to have Artus send men into battle and defend. I'll be removing this restriction. This might make it a bit unbalanced, I'm not sure, I'll have to see it in play. But I do think it might be alright. So that creature can immediately make one weapon attack, adding, and this is where the damage output will come in, adding a D8 to the attack's damage roll. Now a D8 would be the standard superiority die of a fighter. Now the average damage output of a D8 is about 4.5. So in order to know if this is too strong, we also need to know who Artus will be commanding, because we want to add about 8 to 9 points of damage. So we already had 4.5. So we're looking at the guards that he will be commanding. They are the standard guard, but they are using a longsword instead of a spear. So that means that they have an average damage output of about 5, as they will be using their longswords one-handed because they are wearing shields. So if we add those two together, you get about 9.5 additional points of damage. Now that does seem a bit high to me, but I do think it's more fun to err on the side of the players than against them, so I'll leave it as is. So that's Commander Strike. The next maneuver I chose is Maneuvering Attack. So when you hit a creature with a weapon attack, you can expend one superiority die to maneuver one of your comrades into a more advantageous position. You add the superiority die to the attack's damage roll, and you choose a friendly creature who can see or hear you. That creature can use its reaction to move up to half its speed without provoking opportunity attacks from the target of your attack. So that's a mouthful. In essence, it means that when you make an attack, you can survey the battlefield and again spend one of those superiority dice to command one of the guards to go somewhere else. I'll be making similar changes to this text as I did before, thinking about kind of the same things as I did with Commander Strike. So after changing this text a bit, it reads, when you hit a creature with a weapon attack, you can use your reaction to add a d8 to the attack's damage roll and maneuver a creature under your command who can see or hear you into a more advantageous position. That creature can move up to half its speed without provoking opportunity attacks from the target of your attack. So the idea behind this is that Artus does a more ferocious attack, catching one of the enemies off guard, allowing another creature to reposition without provoking opportunity attacks. So the last one I wanted to add is important because Artus becomes way weaker when he doesn't have anyone to command, because a lot of his damage output will be dependent on commanding other people. So what Rally does, as written, is that you can use your bonus action to give temporary hit points to one of your companions. Now, I won't be using this as written here, but it inspired me to do something else, and it's more similar to the relentless endurance ability of a half-orc. So this says, when you are reduced to 0 hit points, but not killed outright, you can drop to 1 hit point instead. You can't use this feature again until you finish your long rest, but that won't matter. So what I want to do is give Artus the ability to save a companion that would otherwise die. So there are two ideas that are floating around in my head for that. One is that Artus is standing next to someone, and when the fatal blow happens, he can kind of maneuver the person away from it and they remain at 1 hit point. The other one is that he can see someone on the battlefield that is about to go down and he can throw them some words of encouragement, and that gives them enough resolve to push on a bit more and remain at 1 hit point. And I do think that I like the second one more, so I'll try to template that. Okay, so right now I have written this as don't give up. When a creature under your command who you can see and that can hear you is reduced to 0 hit points but not killed outright, you can use your reaction to have them drop to 1 hit point instead. Now this of course might be a bit too strong. It basically allows Artus to have semi-immortal companions, as long as they only drop to 0 hit points once a turn. But a few things help here, like when Artus uses his Commander Strike or his maneuvering attack, he already lost the ability to use Don't Give Up. So this would mean that in order to do this, you would have to see that the tides are turning and stop using those abilities, so you lower your damage output in order to save your companions. I still feel like I have to restrict this in some way, but I don't want to restrict it to once a day because I want Artus to be able to save each of his companions at least once. So that's what I'll try to add. In order to limit it a bit more, I've added, if a creature was saved in this way, it can't be again for 24 hours. All that's left to do is just copy and paste the things that I've written down in Notion and adding them as a reaction here. When I do so, I can update the stat block and now these reactions will be added to it. If this was paid content that I'd be publishing, I might add specification what it means to have a creature under a command. To do this, I would use the abilities section and maybe create a commander ability explaining what it means to have a willing creature under your command. Now for my own home game, it's obvious Artus will be leading the other guards. So all that's left to do now is save the stat block so I can make changes to it later on if I want. And if you click the view image button, it will actually download a PNG file of the stat block that you can later print and use in your games. And that's it. That's how I create a custom companion NPC stat block to use in my games. I hope that inspired you to create your own NPC stat blocks as well. Until we create again.